Thank you for taking the time to watch tonight's Bible study, and I hope that you will be blessed by it. This evening, we begin a new Bible study series. I've titled it In Search of the Apostles. We'll start out by looking at the group of disciples known as the 12, and then we'll follow some of them in their journey as apostles. We'll start out with the group that Jesus selected himself in the early days of his ministry. We know those as the 12. And these 12 at times play important roles in the gospel accounts. We have lots of information on some of them and very little on some others. And we'll just do the best that we can. Also, I'm not going to limit this study to just the 12 male disciples of Jesus. Jesus had women disciples too, and at least one of them certainly seems to have played the same role as the other apostles. I'm looking at you, Mary Magdalene. And there's another reason that I want to expand this study beyond just the 12. If I didn't, we would miss a discussion about James, the brother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. And no study on the apostles would be complete without those two. But yet, neither of them were part of the 12. And just to be clear, I'm not talking just about the office of the apostle. I won't be using the definition of an apostle that confines the study to those who personally had seen or been with Jesus. Instead, I'll be using the more expansive and inclusive definition of an apostle that simply means to be an agent or envoy, or as the Apostle Paul would term it, an ambassador of the gospel message. I'm looking forward to this study because I believe that when we look at the stories of the disciples, most of whom became apostles, when we look at their stories, we will then see our own stories. The disciples were very human. Dramedy, comedy, intrigue, mystery, disappointment, anger, despair, failure, success, joy, and transformation are all part of their stories, just like they are all part of ours. The disciples became afraid in stormy weather. They dozed off when they needed to be alert. They complained a lot. They had memory lapses. For example, Jesus had just taught them something one day, and the very next day, they are totally clueless about it. They seem to have selective hearing at times. Some of them lose their tempers. And there's one time where they wanted to call down fire from heaven to destroy those who had offended them. More than once, Jesus had to get on to the disciples. And so often they were so slow to catch on. And on top of all of that, they dealt with issues of jealousy, doubt, ambition, and at times overconfidence. I don't know about you, but when I look at their lives, I see myself. And that's where the good news comes in at. Despite their flaws, despite their weaknesses, Jesus called them to follow him. We are never given the reason that Jesus called them, but we do know that they followed Jesus, and Jesus never gave up on them. They were a work in progress. And who does that sound like? us, right? Christ believes in us more than we believe in him. Christ calls us for reasons unknown to us. And just like Jesus did with the disciples, he never gives up on us. We too are a work in progress. And I really think that we have a lot to learn from these stories of the disciples and apostles. Now, before we start looking at individual disciples, tonight I want us to take a broad look at their calling, at least the initial calling of the first four disciples, and draw a few lessons from it. Since Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and Mark is pretty concise in his stories, I'll go with Mark's version tonight. In Mark chapter 1, beginning at verse 16, we find these words. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw the brothers Simon, that's Peter. Jesus saw the brothers Simon and Andrew casting their nets into the sea, since they fished by trade. Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of humankind." They immediately abandoned their nets and followed Jesus. Proceeding a little further along, Jesus saw the brothers James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They were in their boat mending their nets. Immediately, Jesus called them, and they left their father Zebedee standing in the boat with the hired help, and they followed Jesus. Now, the first thing that I want us to notice is that it is within our ordinary lives that Jesus shows up and calls us to follow. The call to follow Jesus takes place most often where we're at, doing what we normally do, using the skills and talents and gifts and intellect that God has already given to us. And I think that's a neat sentence to say, especially since we just finished a Bible study series on spiritual gifts. Let's be careful, though, not to get hung up on the specific language of fishers of humankind. As I've shared in past sermons, Jesus used the term fishers of humankind because Peter, Andrew, James, and John fished for a living. If Jesus had been talking to engineers, he might have said, "Follow me, and I will make you the builders of the kingdom of God." If Jesus had been talking to doctors, maybe Jesus would have said, "Follow me, and I will make you healers of a broken world." Teachers, Jesus might have said, "Follow me, and let's open the minds and imaginations of people to the love of God." And if Jesus were talking to artists, maybe Jesus would have said, "Follow me, and let's paint the God colors of this world." I like what one commentator wrote about all of this. They, the disciples, were called to bring their best, the best of their core values, the core selves, to follow Jesus. I'll just read the quote. When Jesus called these tried and true fishermen to follow him, they understood the call not as a directive to leave their experience and intelligence behind, but to bring the best of their core selves forward. We don't follow Jesus in the abstract. We don't heed his call in general, as if Christianity comes down to nothing more than attending church or being a nice person. If we're going to follow Jesus at all, we'll have to do it in the highly specific particulars of the lives communities, cultures, families, and vocations we live in. End of quote. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, but most often, Jesus calls us to follow him as the people we are and as an extension of our current work. Jesus doesn't say, I really need some accountants, but you'll just have to do. No. That's not how it goes. You see, whatever we do, whoever we are, wherever we are, however we spend our time, Jesus calls us to follow him. Jesus calls us to be disciples, to be agents and envoys of Christ, to be agents and envoys of his ministry of good news, of reconciliation, redemption, justice making, and restoration. The call to discipleship is a call to reorient our lives, doing whatever we do with a new direction and a new purpose. Peter, Andrew, James, and John's work and lives were reoriented and became a part of the much bigger story of God's work and life on this earth through Jesus. And the same goes for us. This call to discipleship, which we all have, is also one that is filled with grace, as well as a trust in God's power to equip us. Remember what I said earlier, these disciples had their weaknesses, they had their flaws, they had their shortcomings. And here's something that I find interesting about our passage from Mark chapter 1. The disciples are presented throughout the Gospel of Mark as being clueless. And it's interesting that when it came to their initial call, they followed Jesus without question, and they did so immediately. What's up with that? But if we can figure that out, I think that we'll also receive insight as to why we can answer yes to Jesus's call too. I like Barbara Brown Taylor's perspective on this, so I'll just quote her. Barbara Brown Taylor writes, this call, talking about the call of Peter and Andrew and James and John, this call is a story about God and about God's ability not only to call us, but also to create us as people who are able to follow because we cannot take our eyes off the one who calls us, because Christ interests us more than anything else in our lives, because he seems to know what we hunger for, and because he seems to be food. In other words, we are able to answer the call to follow Jesus because God has already been at work in our lives and has enabled us and created us to follow. It's what we're made to be. We are created and made to be disciples. See, I told you there's going to be a lot of grace involved in this, and that God will never give up on us. And the call to be disciples, to be agents, to be envoys, to be ambassadors, is just as urgent today as it was then. Now is the time. Immediately, Peter and Andrew, James and John followed. And now is the time that we do the same. So I hope over the next few weeks, as we look at the disciples and apostles, that we'll learn some new things about them, some of their stories and some of the information that we have about them, including some of the controversies. It is absolutely fascinating. So I hope we have fun in learning some new things, But most importantly, I hope that we see ourselves and our call in their stories, and that we'll be inspired to follow Jesus just as they did. After all, Jesus, after his resurrection in John 20, said, "As God sent me, so I am sending you." Until next week, God's abundant grace and peace to you.